Welcome to the Quadrant Community Call of Tuesday, October 15th. Today, it's all about the color green. We're going to have some conversations around various topics brought in by Craig, and we're going to have a demo by Guy, and then do some roundtable stuff. And so let's get started. And Craig, you go.
Yeah, so a while ago, we kind of talked about, we had an RFC around how to configure subcomponents of Quadrant with like more specific configuration. So a good example is if you want to connect limiter to external Redis, for instance, or to a Redis instance. So one of our community members, Jay, mentioned that this might be an option or an idea, which I thought was an interesting one to discuss. So the idea here is basically that the Kuadrant CR, instead of pulling the entire API into its API, instead references the limitador or the Quadrant or the Authorino that you want it to use as the configuration to set up the configuration options, which means basically it would mean that the Quadrant operator wouldn't set up those Authorino or limiter instances separately from this, right? So you would create your limitador and your Authorino, and then you would create Quadrant, but connect it to the limiter and Authorino instance that you want. So I haven't given this a huge amount of thought, but I thought it was an interesting idea, and I wanted to open it up to everybody else and see what their opinions are. Yeah, go ahead, Guy.
I have two questions on this one. First, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember of an RFC maybe, or at least it's been proposed in the past before, maybe in the architecture repo, something along those lines, how you reuse existing installations of Authorino and limitador, but I could also be wrong. And because I'm sure that even if we do not have such issue in GitHub, but because I'm sure that this has been discussed in the past, I remember some of the questions raised back then, right? So one of them is whether the Quadrant operator would then take control of that resource that was added as a reference in the Quadrant CR or not, in the sense that would it reconcile as it needs for that Quadrant instance to function, or it would just skip creating the corresponding service in that case, right? And I think that also leads to another conversation related that Alex, I'm sure, will remember, of the whole thing of linking abstractions, right? On whether we would rewrite things, the operator would rewrite things that the user otherwise had set, in those resources beforehand, or it would try, to honor whatever it finds there.
Yeah, so at least when I first saw this, I thought to myself, well, the Quadrant operator should at least validate the configuration is valid for Quadrant, right? And if it's not, it should just spit into the status and say, I can't use that instance of limitador because it's not valid configuration. If that's the case, if we can end up with a limitador that's not valid configuration, then we should be able to spot that from the Quadrant operator and report it back into the Quadrant CR and say, I can't use that instance. I do think it's an interesting question around ownership. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the Quadrant. Yeah, I'm not sure if it would be expected behavior that Quadrant would sort of now take ownership of that Authorino instance, and if like you deleted Quadrant, you would delete Authorino. I think that would be kind of unexpected behavior. So I would just say that the idea is that Quadrant would use that instance of Authorino or limitador as long as the configuration it found was valid.
Maybe I should have started with what's the intent, right? What the user wants to achieve with this. Because if there already a running instance of, let's say, limitador that you want to connect, or is the user trying to create like multiple quadrant CRs for any reason and reuse the same limitador?
Yeah, so one of the issues that we have right now is if you want to, if you create Quadrant and you end up with an Arduino and a limitador resource and you want to set some values on that, you have to do that after the fact and directly on those resources, which is not the best experience and is not great for GitOps, as Roy can attest, right? Like you can do it, right? But it's not particularly pretty because you need to start employing things like sync waves to make sure that this thing is there before I do this thing and so on and so forth. So this is like, I have a configuration that I want to use. So I want to apply that configuration and then I want Quadrant to use that configuration, and it's a little bit more declarative. That's the use case. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a discussion we had like 1 year ago, maybe 2. This was the first proposal, and if I remember correctly, it was dismissed because ownership reasons, in the sense, who is the owner of the spec? I'm talking of the spec of that limitator, because I'm talking specifically for limitador in this particular case, but I think it's the same for Authorino. So who is the owner? Obviously, the Quadrant operator will be adding limits to the limitador CR. But what if there are other limits? How to handle that, right? So So the next intent was, let's have a limitador CR embedded in the spec of Quadrant. So limitador CR is fully owned and managed by the Quadrant operator, but still at the deployment of Quadrant, which is, I think, what you ask or what you're concerned, at the deployment of Quadrant, you can specify limitador settings like Redis connection. In the summer, if I don't remember wrongly, in summer we removed that from the Quadrant spec. The Quadrant spec now it's again empty or almost empty. Yes. Yep. And the reason being, I think you were the one explaining the reason being, we don't want to, let's say, commit to this spec for future because it may change and things like that. So yeah, that's I don't have a strong opinion. I'm just trying to recall all the discussion we have regarding this that are in my mind, and obviously maybe surely I forget something. But, yeah.
Okay. Thomas?
Is there also a use case for multi-cluster where you want to use the same configuration for multiple instances of Authorino? Is that not helpful?
I don't think it matters in this case because you would just apply the same patch to both instances.
Yeah, but would this make it easier?
I think if we could solve the ownership problem, that this would be an easier way of setting up your configuration. Yeah. Jim?
I think this might pull in some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. Oh, I thought you said yeah. Sorry.
No, stop jumping the gun. I have a couple of thoughts kind of going around in my head. Like the ownership one is probably the biggest part of it. So firstly, I kind of don't like the idea of putting the reference name to the CRs in spec. And if you're going to allow it across different namespaces, the resource could be in different namespace, then yeah, I kind of agree with that. But if it's going to be in the same namespace, is it that bad that like it's a hard-coded name? And the reason why I say that is if we are okay with saying that if you're going to create the limited door CR and you expect us to use it, we give you ownership of it and we will not tidy it up afterwards. That is not a big change that we have to do today, because when we set the MCRs up initially first, that is the biggest thing that we're doing, is setting the ownership on it so that we can clean up the resources afterwards.
Yep.
But I'm fairly sure that you could create that CR today and we might pick it up to start writing the limits into it. I'm not 100% sure on that. So like, it's kind of, this might already be solved if we agree that they take ownership of it.
Right. Okay.
And we don't clean it up afterwards.
I still feel like there's a validation that should be done there from the Quadrant operator. Also, just to talk about Aguski's issue with the limits, right? If somebody's created limits directly, like I feel like that's part of validation as well, right? If I'm targeting this Auth3 instance and there are existing limits and we're not comfortable with that, then like that goes into the status. It's like, sorry, existing limits can't adopt this instance. So again, I think it, like if we can validate the spec of the limiter or Auth3 CR and feel comfortable knowing that, okay, if it meets these requirements, that we can then adopt it as such. That probably solves most of the issues, right? On the ownership thing, Jim, I feel like right now, if you created an instance, would we not add our ownership, our owner refs to that and then delete it if we, do you know what I mean? Like accidentally delete it because it's named the right thing?
We don't actually delete that resource. We expect the owner reference to remove it, and we only
I understand that part. Okay, go ahead.
We only set the owner reference on creation. We don't set it on update.
Okay.
And the part about validating the configuration, we probably need that today anyway, because I'm fairly sure a user can go in and add limits to the config as it is, and we allow that.
Because I was definitely able to add additional configuration, at least, like so for the Redis config. So the validation step is likely, I would say, needed anyway. I agreed.
Sorry,
so then in this case, just before we come back to Rachel, then in this case, we kind of have two options. One is like this implicit adoption potentially of like a named resource, with this being an option for later on being allowed to specify the name of the resource. And then it sounds like we need that validation anyway. So we probably should create that task and that issue to do that work anyway. But I guess it's still up for debate. Is it better to have a reference than to have the whole thing embedded? And like for me, it means not exposing all of that into the Quadrant CR. And like, so this kind of gets to the operator thing where you have layers with operators, and more configuration from the operand leaks up into the CR into the operand, right? So it's like, how many replicas do you want, and how many, and before long you could end up with the whole deployment being defined in the the operand. So I think you got to be careful with that. Okay, so next steps with this, I guess, create a validate. Sorry, Rachel, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Sorry. Also, sorry, Jim, I didn't see your hand up. So I'm thinking of how do we combine the RFC that we have for observability that we had earlier in around September, August, about exposing some of the observability pieces like tracing, logging, and metrics to the Quadrant CR. that is open that was kind of, we came to a conclusion, but it never got merged because we're thinking probably post GA or 1.x. So how I think there's probably a good case that we can combine those two together and have a solution for that kind of stuff for this as well, because I'm not sure right now how we could go about it, but I think there is a use case that we kind of essentially get the best out of both of them.
So I think do you mean that you add like an observability ref to the Quadrant CR, that type of thing?
I suppose so. The original idea was that we essentially have in kind of like how we had, how do I explain it? We wanted to expose certain parts of observability, so not as much as we were currently exposing, and that's why, so Jim had the PR to pull out a lot of the Kuadrant CR stuff that was in there, but just expose, say, tracing, because instead of having to go multiple CRs, you just have the one source of truth that then gets trickled down. So tracing is a big one, and like logging is another one. So like that kind of stuff. So before, the idea was that we would just have under spec a short resource that would just say what you want to go across all all of Limit or all of Authoring or whatever.
Right. I don't see why this pattern, if we agreed on it, couldn't be extended to other things. And if we need new resources to define what those things are more succinctly, then that's probably on a case-by-case basis.
Cool. I can sync up with you after on and see if we can close out mine and combine it into yours or something like that.
Okay.
This conversation makes me wonder if we shouldn't decide whether we want these resources operating in a limited door to behave more like internal resources for the Quadrant instance, or more like policies, right? That actually attach to the Quadrant CR to extend the specification of the Quadrant CR, right? I don't know if you heard it, but there's this new pattern called policy attachment gate API that we could also implement. And so those other ones could be the other way around the model, right? So I can see how the Quadrant CR could point to them, but I can also see how they could point to the Quadrant CR. In the end, what looks like is that we want to decouple those concerns so they can be managed separately, right? What is common at the level of the Quadrant CR from what is specific to each one of those internal resources or internal services. Maybe because, I don't know, we want to give different RBAC configuration for each one of those, this kind of stuff, right?
Would that not mean adding like a target ref to the limited door CR?
If you want to implement policy attachment as described, yes. I'm not proposing that, not saying that it has to be that way, right? Because we also need to think on the lives of those components standalone, right? Decoupled from Quadrant.
That's what I'm thinking. Like, it feels like the ownership switches around there, right? Like, it feels like now limited door operator should be reconciling figuring out how to configure Quadrant, right? Like, do you know what I mean? If you think
yeah, not necessarily. I mean, I can also see how. I mean, that's because we are in the policy business, right? So we usually create policies and then we reconcile them, right? But if you think on pretty much the rest of the community, what they are doing is they control like the gateway, which is the thing that you attach a policy to. And because they control the gateway, they also reconcile the policy, right? As the party who controls the Quadrant instance, we should also be watching for anything that tries to extend the specification of that Quadrant instance, right? And therefore reconcile the policies in this case. Again, I'm not proposing the different model. I'm just saying that it looks like that this is the intent in the end, right? What we want is to delegate that to another persona who will take control over that particular concern of the Quadrant instance.
Yeah, I kind of see it. I can see both being options, but I kind of see this one a little bit more like the gateway parameter refs, you know, where it's like configuration for this gateway. So I see it a little bit more like that, I think, but that's just my own personal view on that one. Okay, so so I think the next steps is to create an RFC, right? Revisit this whole thing again for the third time. And go from there. So yeah, but good conversation. Oh, it's me next, isn't it? Yeah, so this is coming out of some use cases that we're discovering around setting up Kuadrant and how it might want to be deployed in more of a real world setup. So working with Roy a little bit and also Jaya to set up a repo that has effectively like a reference deployment, I want to call it, for setting up Kuadrant using things like Argo CD and Thanos, and being able to solve certain use cases with that setup. We do have a private repo that does some of these things, so we'll probably look to take inspiration from some of that. But rather than try and reuse that, which has quite a bit of specific stuff in it, we want to try and approach this from like a more generic point of view. So yeah, it's more of a FYI that that's happening in the background, and the idea is that, you know, it will show how to do some of these things, like apply topology constraints, apply limits, resource limits, stuff like that, pod disruption budgets. So more of a closer to production setup than like the quick start would do, for instance. So hopefully provide like a template for others to then take and understand how they could use and install Kuadrant across one or many clusters. That's that. Unless there's any questions, feel free to get involved.
Just one very quickly. If we do that, which sounds like a fine idea, can we maybe add a security session to it? Make sure that we have like things like network policies and, I mean, ways we can get, for example, those Authorino instances configured, right?
Yeah. So nice. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm capturing it in like a set of phases. So like, I think you can go as complex as you want, right? So, but we may have like this set of use cases covered with phase one, then this set of use cases covered with phase two. So we can grow that over time and evolve it. I would like it. I would like if people could like almost pick and choose, like, oh, I want to solve this use case, so I'm gonna, I don't know, check out this version of the repo, or whatever the case may be, or this branch or tag, or I don't know. But needs a little bit more thought. But effectively, I want to solve this use case, so here's the doc and the instructions on how to do that. But yeah, security for sure. Yeah. Okay, it's me again. I should have got a glass of water. So I have a RFC with a basic set of conventions. It's very lightweight. It does not have a lot in it. It's the start of something rather than the end of something, right? So it will grow over time. Anyway, I've linked it here. If you're interested, take a look. If no one's complaining, I'm just going to merge it at the end of the week rather than leave it open for months on end. That's it. From me, anyway.
Thanks. Cool. Okay. Demo time, right? Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
I have to say that I am home alone and waiting for a delivery, so I can see people ringing right in the middle of the demo.
I just had a delivery actually, and the instructor is instructed the dogs were barking like hell, but I just ignored it. That's always an option. Just ignore. I don't know what they do in your case, but
no, they would definitely ring. So, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this is a brief demo of the draft pull request we have opened for the state of the world reconciliation of the written policy based on the POS machinery tooling. So it's kind of a big one. We've been slowly merging multiple iterations on reconciling on the reconciliation of the other kinds of policies and things that around that, right? So we progressed very well the reconciliation of the internal components with an awesome work that Jim did. Then we had Kevin working on the TLS policy front. Mike's working currently on the DNS one and so on. And this is kind of a big chunk that relates to written policy, right? And because this might be the first time you see some of the new features we're introducing with it, I thought it might be a good time, for a demo. Even if the PI itself has not been merged yet, right? So a couple of things that you'll be seeing here is that this will enable having written policy custom resources with the new section name field in the target ref, right? As well as full support for the defaults and overrides merge strategies, right? Meaning that now we can have like atomic defaults, atomic overrides, but also merge defaults, right? Merge of policy rules from different policy resources as defaults or as overrides, right? You no longer see, the route selectors field that was removed in this pull request by Aguski a while ago. And as a replacement for this, now we have the section name, right? Meaning that policies can target sections of a gateway or sections of an HTTP route by adding the section name field to the target ref section. And when, for example, when the target's a gateway, you can specify a listener by name there. When it's an HTTP route, you can specify an HTTP route rule by following this convention of the rules being automatically generated. And this is only until we can fully support Gateway API 1.2 with the section name, with the name field in the HTTP route rules. This will also introduce support for multiple written policies targeting effectively the same resource, right? And I don't only mean different sections of the same resource, but including the same section, right? All the conflicts is worked out by the inheritance concept from policy attachment and the merge strategies, right? You also see, this is also new, support for multiple gateway API providers like Istio and Envoy Gateway running side by side in the same cluster, right? And depending on which gateway class is about the gateway, you will see the internal resources being reconciled accordingly. So I already set up the environment, obviously, and this, if you're familiar with our development tooling, you know that this will get us with a custom build of the Kuadrant operator and Istio installed by default, right? What I did here on top of this is I also installed an Envoy Gateway. So we actually have both running here. We have Istio and we have Envoy Gateway, right? And obviously we have Kuadrant. And here on the top, what you see is a representation of the network topology, or at least the resources we watch, right? So right now we have one gateway class with one gateway created, which is also, by the way, created by this make target here in the Kuadrant, in the gateway system. And this gateway defines one listener, right? So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create another gateway class, right, called Envoy Gateway, and that's going to be reconciled by the Envoy Gateway controller. And another gateway for convenience in the same namespace here as the other one called Kuadrant Envoy Gateway that's based on this new gateway class. So when I do this, you're going to see these things represented here in the topology. So now we have two gateways, right? Two gateway classes. Also, I'm going to create an application here. So the toy store application that we use in our examples and demos. And I'm going to create two HTTP routes. Where the first route is called Toy Store, and it attaches to both gateways, right? And it defines two HTTP route rules, one for GET and another one for POST requests, right? And a second HTTP route that also actually attaches to only one of the gateways, only to the Istio gateway in this case, with only one rule, right? Only the catch-all rule, and it specifies a specific host name here. So let me deploy this. Yeah, and you see, the topology here on the top, transforming with the new state of the world, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip this, but you can trust me. So it works at any time. You can send requests, right? And you can expect to know all the rate limits being applied accordingly, right? Right now, we do not have any rate limits. In fact, we don't even have a Kuadrant instance deployed yet, right? So obviously, this would just go straight to the application, passing through the gateway, and then hit the application, the backend application, and no limits will be enforced. So let me deploy Kuadrant. This will get the Kuadrant object created here. And obviously he also deploys, the internal services, authoring and limit door. And let's now create the first rate limit policy here. In fact, if we right now, let me see if I can do this. If I look for some of those internal resources we usually create, right? After rate limit policy. For example, if we look for Istio WASM plugins, which is the kind of internal resource we use to configure the WASM module for triggering, the call to limit door, there's none, right? As well as we also will not see any Envoy filter resources here, right? And the same for Envoy. In fact, if they did exist, you would also see here them represented in the topology, right? They are not here because they do not exist. So when we create this first rate limit policy that here targets the gateway, right, and defines one limit called global, right? What the reconciler will do, you can already see the rate limit policy attached to the gateway here, and the Kuadrant operator already created the internal resources for this Istio provided gateway, right? So meaning it creates a WASM plugin and it creates an Envoy filter. You can also obviously inspect those as well, right? So if we look for the Envoy filter, it's here. We can inspect it. Basically, it configures, it patches the gateway, to be aware of the existence of this so-called cluster, right? Which is a connection to the limit door service. And similarly, we can also inspect the WASM plugin resource where it basically configures actions, for making the call for the gateway to make calls to that cluster, to the limited door service on conditions, right, with a particular payload, right? So basically, what it's doing is it's configuring to activate that global limit on the scope of each HTTP route that we have, right, if the conditions match, right? Moving on. Now, if we create another rate limit policy attaching, in this case, to the route, right, and with defining a specific set of limits, we're going to see this represented here. So attaching to this route, to the Toy Story route. And because of this, you will see that not only the Istio resources have been updated, because now we have, for any request that follows this path here, gateway, the Istio gateway, this listener, and this route ended up in any of these HTTP route rules. Now we have two policies, right? We have one policy here at the level of the gateway and another one here at the level of the route. So we need to work out the relation between those two policies, right? Which right now, if you notice, it's just a set of atomic defaults for the gateway that will be enforced unless you have a more specific one. In this case, we have a more specific set of limits defined for the route. So this one will be enforced. And we also got internal resources for the Envoy provided gateway. So we also activate these limits when the request flows through this other path here, through this Envoy provided gateway, this listener, and again, this route, right? Anyway, we can inspect this and we can see that it changes the conditions here. So what used to be the conditions coming from the gateway rate limit policy, now it comes from the route one, right? It actually comes from the route. So that route specifies get or post HTTP route rules. So whenever any of those things happen, we want to trigger this specific limit, right? Whereas for the other route that's not being affected by this let rate limit policy I created, we continue to enforce the global rate limit, right? And similarly, if I inspect the Envoy gateway internal resources, right? So this is the equivalent. The Envoy extension policy is the equivalent to Istio's WASM plugin in Envoy gateway world, right? So it's very similar, right? It's going to trigger the specific limit if the request flows there, right? Always scopes to the level of that one HP route that was targeted by the policy in the first place, right? Moving on. So one thing we can do here, right? We can turn the gateway rate limit policy into an override, right? If we do that, this policy is targeting this gateway here, right? So if we do this, what's going to happen is for all the requests that flow through this path here, we're going to be enforcing the gateway rate limit policy and none of the limits defined in the route run, right? Whereas for a request that flow through the Envoy gateway, provided gateway, we keep enforcing the specific limits, right? But we can keep on doing this, right? So far, it's not too different from what we had today, except for the part of supporting multiple gateway providers in parallel, right? Because this is still, in the end, an atomic set of limit definitions, right? So if I do this, nothing really changes here in the topology. It only changes the internal resources. Now we're enforcing the limits coming from the global rating policy, or the global limits here, right? Maybe things get more interesting if we do this, right? This might be the first time you see this field introduced here, right? So this redefines the gateway rating policy as it changes the strategy for merging the overrides. So instead of merging as an atomic set of limit definitions, it merges as a more granular set of limit definitions, meaning that it will only override limits that clash on the name. So it's on the same name, it overrides the limit definition with whatever you see here, right? But keeping all the other limits defined at a more specific level otherwise, right? So if we do this here, for example, we can check, for example, the WASM plugin, and we're going to see that when we have a request to that HTTP route that passes through the Istio gateway, right? We're going to see both limits being enforced in this case, right? Because it's a merge strategy. So when it's a post, we're going to see the specific limit that is defined at the level of the route, but also we're going to see the global limit being enforced because that is inherited from the level of the gateway in a merge strategy, right? Whereas if I move here upwards, this is basically the other HTTP route of the same, sorry, the other HTTP route rule of the same HTTP route. And this is the other HTTP route, right? Which is not affected by the more specific rate limit policy here, only by the gateway rate limit policy, which continues the same here, right? Only one limit being activated. If we do the similar in Envoy gateway, we're going to see that Envoy gateway continue to activate only this specific limit because it's not affected by this gateway rate limit policy here, right? Maybe another thing that I can show is another interesting thing that we can do is we could, for example, edit the rate limit policy that targets the route and make it target only a section of the route, right? For example, we could target only the first rule of the route, which is the one for get a request, right? And if we do this, we're going to see the rate limit policy moving downwards, now attaching to only to this route rule, right? And obviously, all the limits adjusted accordingly, right? So again, now if it's a request to post, which is no longer affected by the more specific rate limit policy, we only get the global being activated. Whereas when it's to /get, we get both the global rate limit, but also the specific one, right? And this is it. So this is all available in a draft pull request that I linked in the document, right? And you can see the very same set of instructions if you want to reproduce this in the form of verification steps there. The next step, to finish up the pull request is we still have some integration tests to fix. And also we need to tackle the part of updating the status of the rate limit policies regarding whether they are enforced or not enforced, because things changed a little bit here with this new configuration involving section names and merge strategies. So we need to be more refined in the way we reported whether a rating policy has been enforced or not, because some limits might be enforced in a given scope, or they're not. Maybe it might have been overridden or not, but not the entire policy. Did I take more than 15 minutes? Hopefully not.
Great. Questions? I have one, like a kind of superficial one. How much can we influence the way this diagram is drawn? Like I noticed some policies were pretty far away from what they were pointing to, or we don't. We cannot.
We don't. I mean, that is how, well, maybe we can, because what you saw on the screen was a Visual Studio extension that happens to parse a dot file, right, in a given way, right? Obviously, we can create whatever a tool to render. In fact, we've been working on a plugin for OpenShift Console where we actually are doing some transformations on that, and it looks a lot nicer.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrew's pointing out that there are many renders for dot files. So yeah.
Right, but you don't say anything about how it looks in the dot file. You do.
Well, I can show that. A dot file is a text file, right? It's just a list of nodes and links.
Just
you
content?
can provide parameters about, optimize distances or layout and avoid overlaps and avoid long lines that go around all those. So there's quite a lot of parameters. It's not always easy to get exactly what you want, but there's a lot of knobs that you can tweak. So it requires a bit of experimentation. I've used it in another project quite a lot, and yeah, it's kind of hard to make it to look always, pretty as you want.
If you watch Jason's the demos a couple of weeks ago on the OpenShift Console plugin, it looks very, very different. A lot nicer, by the way.
Yes. So this is looks like it's getting pretty close, right?
It is. It is. As I said, I mean, now we want to work on the status, how we report it back to the user, right? The whole thing of what is the effective policy, right? Because from the topology, you can still tell that, okay, if I follow this path, I have two policies affecting, my traffic, but what exactly happens, right? Unless you are familiar with those internal resources and you are able to inspect those resources in the same way I did here in the demo, it might be hard, to reason about what's really going on. So that's the kind of thing we want to find a way to express in the status of the policies, or maybe in the affected resources, right? So when you inspect the status of the resources you own, you can get a glimpse of those kind of things.
Do we also want to say or show something about if there are overrides in a policy in that topology, or that's outside of the scope of a topology? Because that's, I mean, could we?
Yeah, right now, the topology is pretty simple. It doesn't even know anything about overrides or defaults or anything, right? It just represents nodes, right? And connect by edges, and where all the nodes happen to be Kubernetes resources that have a kind, a namespace, and a name, pretty much, right? Sometimes it has a namespace, and that's it, right? In the work we're doing for the OpenShift console, I saw already some enhancements on top of that, like link to the actual list of resources in the console, this kind of stuff. So maybe there are things we can do, like for inspecting the resource and getting some additional data.
Thanks again. We should move on probably. Resume presenting my screen. Yeah, we should definitely also make a short video just with some, when it's really done. We should have a video about this. I think maybe also more than just the rate limiting. Okay, let's move on. Roundtable.
That was me. I forgot to put my name beside it. So it's just an ask on each area. There's still quite a lot of issues open. There's a lot less than there were, which is good. But just to set the priority in some of those issues. So yeah, they can still be targeting V1, but maybe they're not a must. Maybe they're a should or a could. That will give us some indication of what's left to do, and because we're after this iteration is the final iteration of development. And, I'll jump on some of those calls as well to see if I can prod and help. Gently prod.
Yes. Thanks. That makes sense. I'm thinking anybody wants to say something on the past week, on work done that other people might not know about, that they should. This is your moment. Okie dokie, go for it, Alex.
So I guess I opened the draft PR, but it's pretty close to be complete. That introduces cell in Authorino, and then we'll be able to flip cell all over the place. Now, I'm gonna be honest, it's not as nice as what I had hoped for. Like, we had a pretty long chat yesterday, Guy and I, and we believe that's the best non-disruptive introduction of that in the existing API. But any feedback would be more than welcome. If anybody has a better idea or whatever, that'd be awesome. So it's in the Authorino thing, and it's pull request 495.
And I think Alex is being modest because I know what he refers to, and how more powerful it could be. But in my opinion, it's already quite cool what we're doing. When you see for the first time the possibility to represent things in cell as cell expressions inside of either the alt config or quite soon as well in the alt policy, I mean, it's a lot nicer, especially when you want to represent things like predicates, like conditions, right, which feels a lot more natural the way one would do in a cell expression compared to like having to break that down into a bunch of YAML fields.
Thanks. So demo next week, Alex?
Yeah, maybe. If I get time to work on a demo. But let's say it'll be somewhere on the list.
Right. Yeah, keep it near the bottom. Okay, anybody else?
Let me just add one thing. There is
Yeah.
a type that I'll delete. It's called response.dynamic cell or whatever, and that has matching test. If you go check the equivalent with JSON, which is literally how you would now do it anyways, I think that's a good example of, I think, this kind of stuff that we could have achieved with making cell I'm not sure, like a better class citizen in the whole thing. Like, you end up with a huge config that just becomes a very, in my opinion, much clearer and expressive way of telling what you're trying to do. But yeah, that type's going to go away because we decided to not. That's an example of like how the type explosion problem would happen if we would do it.
Does this mean we can never go there? But if we would, we would break our API, or?
No, I think it opens many other questions. I think a good example that we covered yesterday, and we didn't even come up with a proper, like, how would we tackle this? If you want to inject more headers in the response today, with the existing auth config as it exists, you can only do this with a well-known set of header names, I guess, the key value pairs, right? There is no real requirement for this, right? So we could absolutely have a thing that dynamically decides to inject certain headers in there and whatnot. But that requires, I'm not sure, like, think of it like a tree structure to walk up the graph more than what we're willing to do, because it's going to create like a huge gap between what you can do and, I'm going to call it GJSON for the lack of a better word, but so what we had so far and what cell enables. So I think what we said is let's look at what we can do to take this API further in the future. But more importantly, as we lose, because the idea was to get rid of the GJSON thing over time, right? So this will, avoid creating this huge gap as well. So it's just for this iteration, Guy and I decided that that's probably a good first step into that.
Yeah, examples of disruptions that Alex is referring to that we're trying to avoid now, to plan better for the future maybe is, for example, we may have to decide whether to add additional fields to the auth config to support the cell stuff in parallel to the existing one, or to break backwards compatibility with the existing one and move towards cell entirely, right? That's one. Another one is, especially for those more fancier stuff, how you build like things like maps of a custom headers that you want to inject. It may feel less declarative compared to the way we do today. So that's also something we want to find, the lines, because the lines can be a bit blurred, right? Exactly what we want, the trade-off between being declarative versus being powerful in the kind of thing you can do.
Thanks. Sorry. Oh, that was another question I had. I can't remember. I think we're at the almost at the top of the hour. Another round. Anybody else wants to say something? I think the only thing I want to say is that I understand, we're getting close to Quadrant 1.0. People are getting stressed, and I just try to be for everybody. Try to be as nice as possible with each other. Count to 10 till 10 sometimes, and good luck everybody with getting it all over the finish line. And I'd say that's it for today, unless somebody tells me it's not. Yep. Okay, cool. See you next week. Take care.